Hey, I'm Pep, and this is a Pep Talk. Now today, we're going to talk about some advanced concepts for role-playing in games such as Dungeons & Dragons. Now I use air quotes on advanced because it's simply more advanced than my previous video on this topic. It might not be advanced for you, perhaps you're well past any of these suggestions. Now the first part of starting to roleplay a character is simply bringing the concept that you have to life. Now, that might sound easy, but in a lot of cases it can be quite difficult. Often you've worked on the mechanical side and maybe only have a slight grasp of how you actually want to roleplay that character. Or maybe you have no intent to really roleplay them at all. My best advice for how to get started into this is to find some personality quizzes or things like that online, or maybe kind of custom create your own, a little questionnaire. As a DM, I once did this for some players. I was planning a long, ongoing campaign, and on top of having them give me actual backstories for their characters, I had them write out a 100-question questionnaire. Now, the things that I asked them ranged from favorite gemstone, favorite flower, favorite food, to what their family was like, listing out their mother, father, brothers, sisters, etc. That's going to send me off on a quick little tangent, actually. Because on top of asking those questions about their family, I would have each family member have their own little quick, 10-question questionnaire, just so I knew a little bit more about each family member. The main purpose of this is so that if I ever needed to, I could use those characters and bring them in and not have the person who owns, essentially, those characters say, "You're not playing them right, that's not how my family would act." Well, I need to know how your family would act as a DM, so it's good to give that little bit of front-loaded information ahead of time. But a lot of people are basically allergic to having families in D&D. And I'm not saying it's not okay to have the "my parents are dead and I have no family, I'm a lone wanderer" kind of character. That's completely fine. But if you've played 10 different D&D characters, and out of those 10, only one has had multiple family members, that might be lazy role-playing. And I get it. It's so easy to just say, no, there's none of that. I don't need to worry about my family popping up at any point. And I'd like to think in the average D&D game, especially if it's only going to last a few sessions, you're likely not going to interact with your family anyway. So it doesn't make sense to make this backstory for them. But if you think it's going to be a long campaign, create these family members and make them interesting. Treat them almost like you would treat yourself. And it makes it so much easier for the DM to have that to work with. Just like everything else that would be on this questionnaire I'm talking about. Knowing your character's likes and dislikes can help the DM craft things around you. Heck, have you ever had a D&D character with a food allergy? Give it a try, it could be interesting. One big point I'd like to bring up though, especially if you are putting all this detail into your character and making these huge questionnaires, you need to be willing to adapt to the party as well. And I'm not saying your character needs to change their likes or dislikes to suit the party. But you kind of need to be able to bend to the whims of the party a little bit. And it's a lot more entertaining if you are fitting in with the party or even on the opposite scale. Some party members are going to be naturally butting heads and hostile with each other. That's great. You can embrace that. But try to make sure you connect with at least one other party member so that there's some sort of a dynamic in the party. In some cases, this might mean tweaking your personality a little bit, but that's what happens in real life. Personalities change as you travel together, as you get to know each other better. And that brings up my next suggestion: change and growth. I know that sometimes when you watch movies or read characters in books, it feels like, this is the same static character the whole time. But if you really dig deeper, you'll notice that the growth of this character definitely happens. Even in a short hour-and-a-half movie, you'll likely see from the beginning to the end, it isn't the same character. And this should 100% be happening when you're playing Dungeons & Dragons. This might be something that happens naturally, that might be something that you've planned, or that happens because of stimulus in the environment. Maybe you just got back from the massive Goblin War that took 8 to 9 sessions. And so at this point, your character, who usually was very fun-loving and happy, might be a little more bitter and distant. And it's not impossible that they may eventually go back to their old selves. But it may be that they stay this way and their character grows and develops. Now, one big negative point I've seen about this kind of mentality is people saying there's not enough time in game for this to happen. Now that can mean in or out of game. If you're only having a few hours of session a night and, you have a session once every month, it makes sense the character growth might not be that easy for you. And from an in-game perspective, all these adventures will go on. I've had a campaign that lasted over a year where we played every second week. But still, in-game, I think it was only 8 or 9 weeks that passed. And that includes, of course, traveling long distances in some cases. So I understand why people would say, I can't have my character have any significant growth, because in essence, I'm not having all that much time pass. And you know what? I'll partially agree with you. You are right. Although, have you ever had something happen to you? I mean, sometimes I've watched a movie that was just so either heartbreaking or heartwarming that it made me think, I really need to change myself after watching it. Well, if I feel like I as a person can have character growth over the course of an hour and a half or 2-hour movie, I think it's okay for a character to change their personality a little bit over the course of a few weeks. And in some cases, you just kind of have to suspend disbelief. Because if you think about it, in a lot of cases, you're gaining 10 to 15 levels over the course, learning extremely complex spells, becoming physical masters of something. Olympic athletes train their entire lives, but apparently it only takes you a week. So you kind of have to forget about how that stuff doesn't work a little bit when you're playing a role-playing game. And because you have to forget about that mechanically, I think it's also okay to forget about it from a role-playing perspective. Don't get so hung up on the time that you don't let your character develop. But on the other hand, if your DM actually does give you the time, and you have a month or even a year time skip sometimes between sessions, use that to your advantage. Have your character come back with a whole new style of clothing, maybe a completely different personality, little bits of extra backstory where something happened and it really changed the way you think about everything. And maybe it's fake and superficial and eventually your character will just go back to the norm, but maybe it actually is something that's long lasting and it's something that matters a lot to your character. Those can be great times to fit in role-playing that doesn't fit when you're just running through dungeons killing monsters. Instead, it happens in the background. And of course, this will cause great role-playing because the other characters in some ways might feel like they're interacting with a whole new person. And that's happened to me in real life. You meet someone you haven't met for a long time and suddenly, oh, you're not who I remember you being. This is interesting. And speaking of interesting, NPCs exist. And they're not just there to get information from or murder in a back alley because you don't want to deal with them anymore. In a lot of ways, and in some very specific cases, think of these NPCs as the DM's characters, because that's kind of what they are. Sure, sometimes they're throwaway people. Maybe it's just a bartender that was randomly created in their head just so that you could have someone serve you drinks. But often these characters are just as thought out as your characters, if not more so. The storyline around an NPC might be pages and pages of backstory. And I think it's important that you respect that. And if you don't like the NPC, that's fine, but treat them as if it were another player character that you don't like the character of. Turn that into an animosity, turn that into playful ribbing. Find a way to make amends and befriend that character. Just don't go killing or ignoring every NPC you come across because they're not important enough. And on the other hand, don't also feel like these characters are immortal and that you can't touch them. If there is an NPC that is doing shady things and you feel like you would hurt or kill someone in that situation, feel free. Just make sure that's not your default button to press. Now, my last point is going to stretch a little bit into how to actually design the character on top of the role-playing. And that is to heavily specialize in something. Now, I know you're probably thinking, Pep, this sounds a lot like min-maxing, and I've been told not to do this. That's right, you probably shouldn't unless you're playing a hyper-optimized campaign. But what I'm suggesting is, in some ways, the opposite. I suggest that you specialize into something a little bit weird or strange. Whether it's something that doesn't really fit your class, or just an area of magic, for example, that isn't always that useful. Now, generally, the big reason for this is so that you are filling a role and you're still filling it very well, but it's not a role that basically instantly ends combat or makes everyone else feel like they're not involved. My favorite example of this is my teleportation themed mage that I like to play. Now he's obsessed with teleportation, he's been studying it all his life. So more than half of his spells are teleportation based, some of which will switch around positions of enemies on the battlefield, and of course the classics like being able to teleport long distances and open up gates. But in combat, he functions a lot like a pacifist. And it's not because he hates violence or doesn't want to hurt anybody. It's more that he's lazy and doesn't really want to dirty his own hands. He'll let the rest of the party do it. But that doesn't mean he's not going to help. He'll create walls and help set up a little bit of some battlefield control here and there. And of course, as I mentioned, teleporting people around the battlefield to where they need to be. And so, from the party's view, he's helping, in some cases, quite a bit. But he's also not overpowering anybody, and he's not just making a battle instantly end. I mean, it can happen sometimes, but that can happen for any character. And outside of battle, he has quite a bit of utility, but again, because he's so hyper-specialized, it really makes that utility function in only one direction. This kind of specialization, I feel, is especially good if you have multiple characters playing similar classes. Let's say someone wants to be a wizard, but so do you. That's a good idea for you to pick maybe a stranger type of wizard. Maybe you focus heavily on divination, for example. This could even present itself with a great opportunity for you and that other character to say that you're friends or brothers or something like that, and work together why your two schools of magic are so different. And that is why I consider this role-playing advice. If you have a character that's that specialized in something, there's usually a good, deep role-playing reason why, which means it'll create a lot of situations where you get to role-play with people about that specialization. Maybe every once in a while the party will question, why don't you have this type of spell? Why don't you have that type of spell? And you can simply say, I don't need to sit there hurting enemies. That's what you're doing. And at the end of the day, I just find it a lot more fun. Anyway, that's been my pep talk. If you have any questions or other suggestions for role-playing and character creation, put them in the comments below and I'll definitely take a look at them. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time. Oh, you're wondering why I've been wearing this hat the whole time. Yeah, right, that was another thing I wanted to mention, is when role-playing, it can sometimes be fun to dress up. And sure, you might not want to dress in full wizard robes or whatnot, but even just wearing a hat, if your character wears a hat, can kind of put you into that feeling. I mean, heck, maybe if you're a character who has a crossbow, and you happen to have a crossbow, you hold it sometimes. Don't have it loaded and shoot at people or anything, but this might help get you into character. All sorts of props can be good for that. Maybe you have a little spell book if you're a wizard, and you actually write your spells in there, so that when you're penciling through to try to figure out exactly what something does, you're actually looking through your spell book. It's a nice little extra level of immersion, especially for all the other players at the table. Anyway, I'm really leaving this time. Thanks again for watching.